The Egypt, it's called the African Health Excon, and it's actually hosted by President Al-Sisi, the president of the Arab Republic of Egypt. So that, I think, demonstrates to you the importance that presidents on the continent, and that certain countries like Egypt and South Africa are the two biggest healthcare markets on the continent. It demonstrates the importance that is being attached to healthcare. So much so that this is done under the auspices of the president. When I had one of my speaking engagements, the Prime Minister of Egypt and his team were also present. So this is a very important agenda item for Egypt. It's an important agenda item for the continent. What is that agenda item, to be precise? It's how do we localize pharmaceutical and vaccine manufacture on the African continent, for a number of reasons, not least because of what we saw what happened during COVID. There were vast swathes of inequality in healthcare, health insecurity, and the continent is taking this agenda very seriously, and there are some positive developments. Now, what do we need to do to advance this agenda? Because you and I spoke probably 6 months ago, and I think it's important to keep speaking, but only if there's iterative progress. So where are we today? There were three major issues, you can call it key success factors. The first is the international procurement agencies that procure these medicines, whether it's Gavi, PEPFAR, USAID, Global Fund, UNITAID. They needed to change their procurement mechanism to allow for procurement to happen from African companies for Africa. So let's analyze what's happened. On the 20th of June, so you're getting to hear this slightly before the 20th, Gavi will be launching, in partnership with Africa CDC and the French government, will be launching the African Vaccine Manufacturers Accelerator, the AVMA. That is a $1 billion package aimed at African vaccine producers, and what they intend to do in that, with that $1 billion package, is an incentive to African manufacturers to get their products registered and pre-qualified by World Health Organization. But the other thing is they will provide a subsidy premium, as we're calling it, of 30 cents per dose, 30 US cents per dose, if the product is manufactured in Africa. So this doesn't necessarily land your orders, but what it does do is it incentivizes Africa to ratchet up and accelerate its vaccine production. The second area we needed to address was that of regulatory integration and streamlining regulatory processes. They're far too onerous right now, because they're kind of 4 steps before you can sell your product. And none of this is aimed at undermining quality, safety, or efficacy or integrity of the product. That must always be upheld. But there is some sequencing and some integration of regulatory aspects that will streamline and make the regulatory process a quicker one. So that area needs to be addressed. We haven't seen a lot of movement around that, although our own regulator here in South Africa, SAPRA, is at a level called ML3, which is amongst the most advanced in Africa. There are only 5 countries that have got ML3 vaccine accreditation. And also SAPRA, in about a week's time, the 14th, will be making some form of an announcement around how it will support localization. We don't quite know what's in that announcement yet. We'll have to wait and see. But these are positive regulatory steps that are being taken. Now, the last issue is all well and good reorientating the procurement mechanisms, but what about the countries in Africa? They should themselves be buying from African producers, and there is work currently being done by the African Union, the Africa CDC, and I suspect the Africa Continental Free Trade Area will come into play as well, to set up a pooled procurement mechanism. So a pooled procurement mechanism means all the countries on the continent collaborate, and they aggregate their volumes so they get economy of scale, and then that allows them to negotiate with local manufacturers on the continent. It's called a pooled procurement mechanism. Again, a lot of work still needs to be done on that. So some progress since we last spoke and headed in the right direction, and some really big announcements like the Gavi announcement coming up. I should also mention PEPFAR, which is the single biggest procurer of antiretrovirals in the world. It's the President's Emergency Relief Fund for AIDS. They've just made an announcement that they will procure $100 million of antiretrovirals annually from the continent to the appropriately accredited African producers. So some very positive announcements and steps that are happening.
What has been holding us back? Because when you look at vaccine trials, we have lots and lots of those trials on the continent where one can even say it looks like Africa is a guinea pig. What is holding us in terms of moving to a satisfactory position or level in terms of manufacturing of vaccines?
Look, I think what's holding us back is the three areas I just mentioned. I think if you, and I'm not suggesting these are the only three areas, but they're the three single biggest interventions or critical success factors, if you want to call it that. If we address those three areas, we can change the whole landscape of vaccine. But we're not only talking vaccines any longer, because the mandate of the African Union and Africa CDC has been expanded now to include vaccines, pharmaceuticals, therapeutics in other words, and diagnostics and medical devices. So the scope of this has expanded, and we would have a really good chance of achieving significant progress on this if we resolve these three issues that I just spoke about. Now, interestingly, in Egypt has got a very aggressive localization program, and they set up a whole new agency called the UPA. It's the United Procurement Agency. And at the head of the UPA, and I had opportunity to meet with him, the chairman, he's like a super minister in Egypt. And it's providing results, because Egypt is now producing in volume, not in value of course, in volume, 91% of products that can be produced in Egypt are now being produced locally. And that's significant progress. So we need to, in other countries on the continent, start emulating that, but we need that pooled procurement mechanism so that there is a collaborative approach by all the health departments on the continent to procure from African companies through this pooled procurement mechanism. Then you will have your international agencies, Gavi, PEPFAR, UNITAID and others, and Gavi procures 60% of the vaccines for the continent, and then you'll also have the pooled procurement mechanism, which is the other 40%. That's what we need to pull together for the continent.
Let's talk about the safety. Since COVID and after COVID, we see a lot of information in terms of the effects of these vaccines, true or false, misinformation. But how do you ensure that the issue of safety of such vaccines is respected? Firstly,
medicines and pharmaceuticals are the most regulated commodities of anything I know. They're extremely robust and rigorous systems. All the regulators around the world, in our case SAPRA in our instance, have a particular mandate around quality, safety and efficacy. And it's also law that if there is any adverse event, that has to be reported within 48 hours, and every single company and a doctor or a pharmacist, those are usually the people that report it, they're obliged by law to report this. So once that report happens, then that particular company and the regulator are obliged to investigate this. Okay, now you can argue, but you're then investigating yourself. You're not. You're giving it out to an independent, to an independent entity. So we've just heard today there was some Benylin that was produced in South Africa that got exported to Nigeria, right? We saw that. And there were claims that there were toxic levels of glycol in the Benylin cough syrup that was exported. Okay, so that complaint goes through a whole pharmacovigilance process, and an independent laboratory is appointed to investigate that. And the independent laboratory actually found that there wasn't in fact glycol. So it was speculative, but you can't take the risk, of course. But it's really important for the public to understand that the regulator controls this by an act of Parliament. They are required to ensure quality and safety and efficacy of medicines. When there is a case like this, then an independent entity investigates it. It's not the same company, because imagine if obviously the same company does its own internal testing, but it was an independent source that tested this and found the complaint to be inaccurate. So now when it comes to vaccines, many of the side effects that we are seeing from vaccines are for patients that would in any event have suffered that particular condition. So it could be, for example, some people have said they've had strokes following the vaccine. Okay, but were those patients candidates and eligible to have a stroke in the first place because of their cardiovascular condition, because of genetic factors? You know, there's all of these are predisposing factors, and if you have a look at it, that's actually what caused that particular condition, not really a side effect of the vaccine. So that's what you've always got to be clear in medicine, that everything's got to be evidential and empirical. And it doesn't mean that if you took a vaccine, you're going to be prevented from getting a stroke or a heart attack later or whatever. That's not the case at all. The vaccine had a very particular purpose, and if there are cardiovascular events afterwards, more often than not, they are related to an underlying condition that the patient had in the first place.